but I'm going to talk about communication, collaboration, and community. And when I'm talking about this stuff for the purposes of this workshop, I'm mainly referring to online courses because teaching an online course can kind of pose some challenges when it comes to doing things like just simply communicating back and forth. And I know that's a huge concern for a lot of faculty. I teach the best practices in teaching online course, and I always start out the course with an introductory discussion where I have people introduce themselves, and I have them list their biggest concern going into teaching an online course. And a lot of times it's, how am I going to communicate with my students, and how am I going to, get that same communication that I can get in a face-to-face course. So that kind of was one of the reasons it prompted me to do this workshop. And a lot of this information is in that course. We do cover that stuff in the course itself. So, so we have communication, collaboration, and community. And the way that I define the three, so communication, the way I look at this is basically just the exchange of information between two or more people. So just simply exchanging information and sharing. So we do that in a face-to-face course just simply by walking into the room. We say hi, we start talking. It's just kind of a natural thing. But how do we do that online? Collaboration, the way I define this is basically the exchange of information, but when people are doing it, they're working towards a common goal or to solve a problem. So we're still communicating, hopefully, but when we get to collaborating, it's because we're trying to accomplish something together. And then where you hopefully can get a community feeling going on is where it's kind of a combination of the two. So you're communicating back and forth, whether that be student to instructor, instructor to student, or student to student, but you're doing it in a combination. You're doing a combination of the two within a group of people. So we can communicate one-on-one, we can collaborate one-on-one, but when we get into a full course situation, we got multiple people doing that. And so that hopefully, will give the sense of community in an online course, which is kind of the goal here. And in order to get the feeling of community, there's two main things that I'm going to talk about. Communication is the big one, and expectations. So we need to communicate in order to do the other two, right? That's kind of the top of the list. So we have to communicate in order to collaborate. We have to communicate and collaborate in order to get the feeling of community. And in order to communicate effectively, we need to set expectations for the students. So everybody involved knows what to expect, okay? So we'll start with communication. We have two types of communication. There's synchronous and asynchronous. And each one of these tools, whether it be a synchronous tool or an asynchronous tool, they all have their own kind of unique characteristics and things that they can do. And synchronous tools are tools that are basically live. So a telephone call, an instant message, a chat. So the chat room in Western Online is a synchronous tool. Video conferencing. So what we're doing now is a synchronous tool. Synchronous tools are live. So basically, the communication is in real time. This tool here that I'm using for the webinar is one that I actually promote quite a bit when teaching online, and I promote it a lot and I do a demo of it in the best practices course because it works really well, and there's a free version that you can sign up for when you get an account, and it's a really great tool for doing video conferencing. The other type is asynchronous. Now this is more of communication where there's actually some lag time in between communications between each other. an email would be an example of this. So if I send an email, you may get it right away, but are not able to respond, or you may not even get it for 2 days. Once you get it, you respond, and so on and so forth. Same with the threaded discussion. So that's an asynchronous form of communication that's used a lot in online courses. The discussion, you're probably familiar with how this works. You post a discussion question, you put in some parameters for the students. You have to have the question answered by this date, respond to, so many students by this date. So it's basically a way of, kind of taking advantage of that flexibility of being in an online course where you can kind of work on it at your own time within a set of parameters that you set for the students. Other things include collaborative writing tools like wikis. I like to consider Google Docs a version of this, so you can collaborate on a Google document with other people that might come in at later times to work on it, and so on. I'm going to talk about some different levels of communicating here. There are different levels of things that we want to do in our online course, and some different ideas of the types of communication tools that you might use in order to accomplish these. So we have prepare, interact, share, collaborate, develop, and then hopefully we can, do all this together, and we can have a community in our online course. The first thing is preparation. And when you're preparing, and by preparing I mean preparing your students, not necessarily preparing your course, but preparing your students as well as yourself for the online course experience. And this is kind of a period of orientation where you're providing support for your students. You're giving them the expectations that they need. Things that I do in this stage are a welcome email. So about a week before an online course starts, what I like to do is I send a welcome email. And included in that email is all the information they need to access the course, to know what to do in terms of communicating with me, to get in and take a look at the introduce yourself discussion that I'll go over here in a little bit. So this stage is kind of where I'm saying, hey, this is how it's going to work. This is how I want you to communicate with me. We're going to set those expectations. Another thing is a course survey. So I've given a survey to my classes before, online and face-to-face, where I'll ask them some questions to just kind of get an idea of where they are in terms of the subject matter. And then you can kind of gauge, where your students are in terms of what they're familiar with, and you can even kind of customize, your instruction based on that. You might get, usually, you have it all over the gamut. You have some beginners all the way up to people who are experienced in the discipline that you're teaching. But so a welcome email and a survey are a couple of examples of getting started and preparing your students for your course. So the introduce yourself discussion. So this is best supported by early social interaction between students, and hopefully you can get your students to introduce themselves to each other, and kind of build some rapport with each other, get to know each other. And this is the introduce yourself discussion that I was talking about earlier. So what I start out the course with is, and I put this in the welcome letter, I usually open the course a few days before the date that it's technically supposed to start. And I ask them to submit to this introduce yourself discussion, where I have them put in, their name, for the best practices course, I put in if they've taught online before, fun fact about them, and then an optional picture. You don't have to post a picture. I don't make them do that, but that's an option that I give them. And then I ask them a question, which is, what are your major concerns with teaching online? So I'm technically kind of doing both, a survey and some rapport building in the same activity here. So I'm asking them a question to get an idea of, where they are in terms of, how they feel about teaching online. And then hopefully the students will get in there and reply to each other and just kind of use it as just a way to get to know each other. So this is the introduce yourself discussion. Introduce your self-discussion. I kind of went already over this. This is an example of the one that I put. So before we begin work in the weekly modules, take a few moments to share some information about yourself. Please include the following in your introduction. So teaching experience, courses that they've taught, fun or interesting fact, and then post a picture, and I make sure to put that optional, and then here's the question that I ask. By the way, I always go ahead and go in first myself and go ahead and introduce myself in there, even though with the course there's already an instructor introduction page. But I go ahead and do this not only to be a part of that, but just to kind of give them an example so they can see what I'm looking for, basically, and they can use that as a guide. Okay, so the next one is share. At this point, hopefully students are getting a little more comfortable. So you've prepared them, you've set some expectations on what you want them to do. They've gone in, they've done introduce yourself. They're kind of getting familiar with how it's going to work within the course, and hopefully they'll start to communicate with each other and share some ideas with each other. Some examples here would include a chat or a Q&A discussion, which is what I do. Some people call it a coffee house discussion. So I put a Q&A discussion on the home page of my course. And this is what it looks like. So the instructions just say, use this discussion area to ask questions of your fellow students or simply have an open discussion on any topic. The idea for this is to help each other out, get ideas, or simply just get to know one another. So it's another area where they can kind of do the whole same thing where they do in the introduce yourself. But this thing I have on the home page so they can see it every time they come in there. And it's more for the hope is that they'll get in there and ask each other questions so they can help each other out. And I don't go in and usually I don't go in and reply to any of these. This is simply something that I provide for them. I do go in and read anything that's posted in there. And then if I notice, somebody posts a question in there and no other student has answered it, I might go ahead and answer that question. But the hope is that they'll get in there and ask each other questions, whether it be about the course or anything else here at WIU or anything else, period. And hopefully they'll get to communicating that way. Hopefully at this point, they're going to start collaborating. So they're sharing information with each other, they're communicating with each other, and they're going to start collaborating with the common goal of solving a problem. Here's where you'll use tools like discussions. So you'll have a posted discussion question. You'll have them answer that question. And then usually what people do is require that they respond to one or two other of their students. And they're going to start collaborating because they're going to start talking to each other on this specific question that's related to the course. Other tools would be collaborative writing. So kind of like I was talking about earlier with Google Docs, collaborating on a Google Doc, file sharing, or even video conferencing. Develop. This kind of just goes a little bit deeper with the discussion questions. So students are getting a little more independent, and this is where you're going to start asking some really deep questions related to the course. So here's an example of a discussion question that I post in my course. So this basically is a way for them to kind of guide their own learning. So I give them about 6 options in this particular question. So they can choose one of these questions to answer. So they're kind of choosing their own path in terms of their learning. So they can choose one of these, and hopefully you'll get, you know, a gamut of students choosing different questions. Then they start replying to each other, and then they all get to talking about, you know, several of these different questions. Okay, at this point, you've gone through all of these levels of communication, preparing, interact, sharing, collaborating, developing, and then you know, the combination of all this and using all these different tools, which, by the way, I recommend you use a mix of tools, not just one tool for communicating. So I would use, you know, it depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. A simple communication, I would use email. You know, and you get further down the levels here, you'll use discussions for certain things. You'll use chat for other things, video conference for other things as well. So at this point, you're kind of transferring ownership, where the students are getting more independent, and hopefully this feeling of community is developing within the course. The second part of this is, in addition to communication, is expectations. And the way we set expectations is by setting up what I call a communication plan. And this is something that you'll include in the syllabus. You can put it in, you know, an area within the course as well, if you'd like to do that as well. But basically, this is an opportunity for you to set expectations related to the course, in terms of communication, posting to assignments, things like that. So being extremely clear as possible is important here. So things you might address within your communication plan: your online office hours. So when are you going to have your office hours, and in what platform? So online, you got to kind of decide how you're going to do office hours, because you can't require students come to your office in an online course. You can't require them to be anywhere, for that matter. So some options for online office hours would be the chat room in Western Online, which is what I use for the best practices course. I set up a chat, and you know, during the set times that I set, I open it up and I throw it in a window up on the side of the computer and leave it open for that hour. There's an option there to turn on sounds, so if somebody comes in, it will ding and it'll make you aware, in fact, that somebody comes in there. But other options are simply phone call. You can just give your phone number and say, hey, call me at my office during this time. Zoom is another one. And you could use a combination. You could start a chat, and then as you're chatting, you kind of decide you need to have a visual. So you'll say, okay, let's get on Zoom, and we'll do it that way. But just making them aware of when and how they're going to do it in your communication plan is important. And your statement of your availability pretty much for everything, and your responsiveness. So if a student emails you, sometimes you'll get students who expect an immediate response, right? That's impossible. Just not practical, not going to happen in an online course. But setting the expectations for them on when to expect a response is something that is important to know. So I put in my communication plan, if you email me, I will reply within 48 hours. You can put 24 hours, whatever it is that works for you. Then if it's on the weekend, you probably will not hear back from me until Monday. So they're aware of that fact. So they're not going to send their email and sit there and wait for a response. A lot of times I can reply immediately, because usually, I'm here from 8 to 4:30. I have a regular day job, and I'm on my computer, and this is what I do. So I'm able to reply pretty quickly, but I make it aware of the fact that after 4:30, probably won't hear back from me until the next day. And if you hear from me on the weekend, you won't. If you send me an email on the weekend, you won't hear from me until Monday. So I just make that known. Same for grading and feedback. So I put in expectations on when they can expect things to be graded, and have their feedback sent to them. So they're not just kind of in limbo waiting for that information. So I give them an idea of when to expect that. Expectations, some extra things you might include in your syllabus, like expectations for netiquette. So especially if you're doing discussion questions or doing some video conferencing like this or chat, make them aware of the proper netiquette in terms of communicating online, and then other things that are more pertinent just to your specific course. So this is the kind of stuff that we like to have in our communication plan. Like I said, usually put it in the syllabus. Mine's at the very beginning of the syllabus, and I have mine divided into 3 different areas: my email, online office hours, and then I make them aware of that community discussion. So for my email, here's my little blurb about my email. So I make sure they know which email address I want them to use. I don't like the Western Online email tool. It does not work well. So I don't want them to use that. So I want them to use my email WIU account. And then I let them know, when I will be monitoring the course and when to expect a reply from me, was usually within 24 hours. So that makes them aware of that. Next is my online office hours. So like I said earlier, I use the chat. And so I let them know, here's the dates and times that I'm going to be in that chat room. And they can go in there and access it. And then this is basically the same thing you saw earlier. It's a little blurb about the community discussion that I've provided for them, for them to get in and kind of ask questions of each other. So this gives them a little more information about that. Now the grades and feedback one, it's still part of my communication plan, but it's not in the same area as the other stuff in my syllabus. As you saw in that little screenshot, most of my communication plan is, at the top of the syllabus. My grading, feedback and stuff like that, I put that within the grading area to let them know, okay, this is when you expect to have the grades and have the feedback, no later than, the week after the assignment is due. So I put that in a separate area, but still part of the communication plan. So just a quick rundown of some of the different tools. So some of these are synchronous tools, some of these are asynchronous tools. Within Western Online, we have the chat tool, obviously, discussions. There's also the announcements tool. I use this one quite a bit as well. Now, I post an announcement at the beginning of every week. And in this announcement, I have a little video that I've recorded that's just kind of a little introduction. Here's what we're going to do for this week. I list out all the checklist items. This assignment is due this day, this discussion is due this day, and I leave that up for the entire week. And then beginning of the next week, the next one will pop up. And I use the scheduling tools within Western Online. I set that all up ahead of time, and I basically just kind of let it run. I don't have to worry about it. That is another form of communicating. I also use an announcement every time I send an email. So after grades are posted for the week, I'll shoot everybody an email and say, okay, grades are up, ready to go. I'll also post that exact same message in an announcement. So anytime I send an email, I also do it as an announcement as well. Then some of the feedback tools, there's several different areas in Western Online to leave feedback depending on what it is you're leaving feedback for. And I get a lot of instructors who get confused on where to find feedback that they've left. And it just depends on where they leave it. Grade book, like I've had instructors leave feedback in an assignment or in a quiz question and expect it to show up in the grade book, which it does not. It shows up just in the quiz. They have to view the results and all that stuff. So be aware of where you're leaving your feedback. And also be aware of how the students will be able to access it so you can let them know. So there's assignments, quizzes, discussions, and then there's the grade book. Some other tools, Google Drive, I talked about that a little bit. Obviously, we have email, Zoom video conferences. There's also Google Meet, which works really well. Dawn does a workshop on Zoom. We have a tip sheet on Zoom. Zoom works really well. I like it for doing these webinars. You can also use it simply just to record a video. So you could have a Zoom session but not have anybody come in, and just use it to record a presentation and then save it out as an MP4, which is kind of nice. And you can do all that with the free version. Another thing I use is doodle polls. So in the best practices course, I have I do a demo of the chat tool, and I do a demo of this Zoom tool that we're using here. And I use a doodle poll to set up times, and then I have people vote on the times that work for them. And then because it's a optional activity, I just choose the times with the most votes, and that's usually the ones that I go with. And so that's another kind of neat little tool to kind of gather some information from your students.